We'll now move into the second part of our session this morning, looking particularly at the environmental footprint of the Outlook report. And I'm really delighted
Recording in progress.
And apparently that was a warning I should have said right at the beginning, that we are indeed recording this this session. So everything that you do say can and will be taken down and no doubt used by others as evidence against you. So as I was saying, environmental footprint, looking at the Outlook report, I'm delighted to be joined by two really fantastic interveners this morning that I think are going to share with us their expertise and experience and no doubt insights. In a moment, I'll ask Tamas Kristen, I hope I pronounced that roughly correctly, super, Senior Research Scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. But first, I'm going to pass the floor to Ana Luisa Barbosa, Spatial Data Scientist at the Joint Research Center. Ana Luisa, really terrific to have you with us. The floor is yours.
I will start. So yesterday we spoke about baseline, the outlook, and we introduced how important it is, the different modeling tools and playing with the different scenarios. And today my presentation is about what if we implement different mitigation technologies and we look into how does climate change mitigation affect medium-term market prospects. And of course, this study is based on ECAMP4, which is a report carried out by the Joint Research Center on economic assessment, greenhouse gases mitigation policy options for EU agriculture. And so, first of all, a bit of policy context. We all know that European climate law sets a legally binding target for the EU to reach climate neutrality by 2050, in line with the Green Deal. And we know that the agriculture, forestry and land use changes are central in this challenge because they can both sequester carbon and they emit, they can reduce the emission of the greenhouse gases emissions. So EU policies, especially the CAP, CAP, put more weight on how we can implement different technologies and management options to tackle this challenge. So for this, the Joint Research Center has carried out for over a decade different studies. We call ECAMPA studies. And these studies look into how the different mitigation technologies the impact of these mitigation technologies on the emissions. So we have different 4 reports, and the last report is the one that we put together technologies, different mitigation technologies with the follow sector, agriculture, forestry and land use. And we are already now working on the preparation of the next report. So what is the objective of this report is to assess a follow potential contribution to the EU 2050 climate neutrality. And within this, this report, we look into different scenarios. One is on deforestation, where we expand forest area. We look into the forest management, where we reduce the forest harvesting by 10%. And we also look into the histosols, the protection of organic soils or peatlands, and how this can cut nitrous oxide and CO2 and carbon sequestration. So, and then there is carbon pricing, where we look more into the tax emissions of agriculture and subsidies the removals. And we also put together the deployment of technologies. And finally, we bring together all these scenarios and we looked into the strongest impact of these technologies. So for this, we use the Capri model, which is a partial equilibrium model that brings together supply and demand, balance the supply and demand at global markets. And we look into the environmental and economic assessments, in specific the greenhouse gases reductions, carbon sequestration, and economic impacts. So let's now move to the results, how the climate change mitigation measures affect overall greenhouse gases emissions. And I would like to bring this picture to the audience. We have here the different scenarios: histosol, protection, carbon price, and combined scenarios. And we look into different indicators. First one is on the EU agriculture greenhouse gases emissions. The second is on the greenhouse gases emissions on the LULUCF sector. And we also look into the emission leakage, so the impact that has out on the rest of the world, and on the crop production and animal production for the three different scenarios: histosols, carbon price, and combined. So first of all, we can see that carbon price and the combined scenario, they are very similar, but there are a very small difference that is quite important, is the way how we treat the histosols. So we see that in terms of LULUCF emissions, histosols have an impact of can reduce 22%, while carbon price can reduce 65%. And this cumulative effect, we can see it in the combined scenario. Okay? So in terms of agriculture emission leakage, we have in the histosol scenario, we have a negative emission leakage, so we don't have really impact outside of the world. But in the carbon price scenario, the scenario that we have the strongest effect on the emissions, both on the agriculture and on the LULUCF, we also see that we have some emission leakage on that side, okay? And on the crop production, we see that the histosols has no effect on the crop production, almost nothing. And we have some impact on the crop production and animal production. So in terms of technology adoption across the different scenarios, in this chart we can see histosols, carbon price, and the combined scenario. So the first scenario, histosols, we see that following histosols, which is the only measure that we enforce under this scenario, can reach 95 million tons of CO2 equivalents. That means that if we enforce the model to say that histosols will be set aside and they will be protected by restoring them, this is the maximum potential that we have. Under the carbon price scenario, we also have histosols, and we see that farmers are likely to take this option because they found it cost-effective attractiveness. But we also see the influence of other measures. And on the combined scenario, we bring together the histosols, let's say the enforcement of this technology, together with the other technologies. In the carbon price scenario, let's say that the farmer is, the adoption of this technology is volunteer. So we see that we cannot reach the maximum potential of this mitigation measure. So on top of the, also in addition to the histosols following, we have other technologies that hit more on the livestock part, and we talk about feed additives, 3-NOP, nitrates, linseed, and which has a strong impact on the methane reduction. We also have anaerobic digestion that reduces methane and nitrous oxide from manure, and nitrification inhibitors and precision farming, more on the crop side. So from this figure, we can say the main message is that mitigation technologies helps, but the structural or land use management plays a big role, and management practice like histosol protection often deliver a bigger reductions, okay? And of course, this cost effectiveness varies across the different member states, meaning that this figure might change completely depending on the member states, as we can expect. Now, let's look into the impact on the production of land use prices and consumption of the different of the three scenarios. And here, in terms of livestock production, we see that carbon price, which is the scenario that has the strongest effect on agriculture and carbon sequestration, significantly reduce livestock production, especially in beef, and this can drop even up to 8%. Okay, And we see, as I mentioned before, that histosalts protection alone barely has an impact on the food production, and they mainly reallocate land. Okay, thank you. And then we have the crop production, minor effects under the histosalts protection scenario, but we see a moderate decline on the oilseeds, mainly rapeseed, most affected by the carbon price. Okay, now in terms of land use impact, we see that the carbon price expand forest area by 5% by 2050. We go from 174 to 183 million hectares. And of course, carbon price and combined scenario, they show differences in terms of land use patterns compared with the reference scenario. And grassland reduced by about 5%, but this is mainly related with the land that is taken over by forest land. And land use remains stable under the histosalts protection scenario, meaning that there are some reallocation of land, but in terms of land use changes, we don't see that changes. So if we look closer into what is happening on the AU set-aside of histosalts on grassland and cropland under the histosalts protection scenario, we see that histosalts is a high-impact strategy because it cuts both the non-CO2 emissions and soil and the carbon emissions. So there is a direct effect on the livestock production activities. And of course, farmers may replace part of the grass-based fodder by cereal-based feeds. So there are some spillovers on the feed market. The effect of the following histosalts and restoration can be seen on the carbon price and the combined scenarios, as following histosalts widely used due to the introduction of the carbon price. So this effect that we see in the following histosalts is also seen in the combined scenario and the carbon price, as we've seen before. And we see that there is also geographic variability, and countries like Poland, Germany, Ireland and Netherlands, they are most affected by this measure. And of course, grassland is the one that it's more grassland than cropland. In terms of AU prices, beef faces the large price rise. Of course, it drives consumers toward cheaper options like poultry, pork, and plant-based proteins. And producer prices rise under the carbon pricing, especially for ruminant products. And consumer prices also rise, but this difference is not that much on the price of on the producer's prices, but is not enough to trigger the substitution of the commodities. So in terms of consumption patterns, we see that higher beef prices drive the consumer to the low, cheaper options like poultry and pork, and increased demand for plant-based proteins. These shifts support the greenhouse mitigations by reducing the consumption of high-emission ruminants. And of course, this is a good example on how the market signals and dietary trends to align with the climate goals. So to conclude, let's say that the agriculture sector can make a significant contribution to the EU climate neutrality. And the follow sectors, they can both cut on the emissions by 29% and boost the sequestration by 87% by 2015. And let's say that technologies and mainly the management-based greenhouse mitigation options, they are very important, especially the protection of histosalts, because they can highly contribute to the significantly reduce the emissions. And there is also the carbon price, which has a strong effect, but with somehow multifaceted impact on the agriculture markets, because it can effectively reduce the greenhouse gases emissions, increase the carbon sequestration, but this comes with the costs on the feed sector and on the livestock, which leads to a higher producer and consumer prices and shift on the consumption towards a lower emission food and carbon leakage on the rest of the world. And that's it. And of course, if you want to know more about this study, this is the link to our study. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Anna-Luisa. Can I just, a couple of follow-ups. The first one is just your conclusion where you finished that, and Tassos talked about the evidence that we've got that we can move the supply curve to the right without impacting on production and ultimately on consumer prices. If I understood correctly what you're saying there, carbon pricing for you can enable us to mitigate climate impact, but there is going to be a cost to the producer and eventually to the consumer. Ergo, I assume you lean away from carbon pricing as the most valuable option to deploy.
Indeed. So under this study, we have seen that it is the scenario that shows the highest impact in terms of both reducing the emissions, but also to increasing the carbon sequestration. But this comes with a price,
Sure.
and it will hit both crop production and animal production, and prices will raise, and we will see that will be a shift in dietary towards the cheaper options, so plant-based and poultry and pork. So this is the conclusions of this study in specific.
Hugely interesting and obviously clear implications there for policymakers. A point then perhaps of clarification or building my understanding. What happens with emissions from conversion of pasture into crops? I presume that the next effect of that reduction in emissions from ruminants, an increase the effect is a reduction in emissions from ruminants, an increase in land conversion. Is that correct?
Exactly. So if we convert grassland to crop, we will have two effects. First of all, price will raise because we don't have on the feed markets, because we don't have more availability on the oil seeds, and we will have an increase on other cereals, for instance, and so we will have an increase on the. So we have less land available on livestock and also on the feed availability. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. Anna-Luisa, thank you so much indeed. I found that also probably challenging to my own perception of where we might be and where carbon pricing might come in. So I enjoyed reading that last night in preparation for this and enjoyed your explanation. Please do stay with us. Tamas, I'm going to pass it to you now for your perspectives on this. You have the clicker there, should you need it. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to present to you the baseline land use and emission trajectories in the EU agriculture system. Overall, I'm presenting to you work from the Horizon Europe research project Lamasus and also sister projects where we assess the baseline and which was presented yesterday on day one, both from the OECD FAO and also from the last year's DG Agri baseline in terms of its emission trajectories and its land use. Overall, the idea here is that this brings together work from 3 projects which improve analytical tools for EU agri-food and policy support. And the figures that we use where we contrast the agricultural outlook from are based on research from 3 projects. This is the Brightspace, our sister project, led by Wageningen Research, the Lamasus, which is where I'm the scientific coordinator, and Act for COP27. And essentially these projects were coming together, and the idea would be to have assessment of the baseline through multiple modeling tools. That means that what we do is that we align on the, I hope this is more or less legible for you. The design was slightly messed up at one point. overall, the idea was that in these 4 projects, all of them work with forward-looking modeling, and all of them look with modeling in agriculture and land use sectors, and they bring together key models which are used for this kind of assessments, both from the climate assessment as well from the agriculture and the forestry side. And usually, this kind of baseline outlooks are done with one set of modeling tools. So the idea was here that we take similar modeling tools, a bit more from the academic side, or some of the modeling tools that are not involved in this, and we try to harmonize on the what goes into the baseline, namely the macroeconomic alignment, so the GDP projections, the population projections, and the technological and productivity drivers. And we feed this into our models and check how much we align with the baseline and how much the uncertainty essentially around this is. Because the models bring their own data sets, they bring their own assumptions, some are partial equilibrium, some are general equilibrium models, some are more global or more European in focus, and essentially we bring a kind of an assessment of the baseline, and essentially this is the result of this harmonization. So you have the Capri, Globiome, Image, and Magnet models participating. And we can look on the trends essentially. So for this kind of the trends, we align, as I said, on the GDP growth and population growth trend. So this is from the last year's medium-term outlook. Essentially, we feed this into the model, and beyond 2035, because we only have it for 10 years, we follow kind of a middle-of-the-road socioeconomic pathway, and similar to the baseline process that was presented yesterday also, we follow essentially with observed policies, so we don't have policy shocks and we do not have climate change shocks, new ones in there. So that's basically the idea here. And coming to our better results, so on the land use trends, you can see here how this is assessed. Essentially, you can see the black line, right, the continuous black line, those are the agri-outlook results, right? And this kind of green span is what our models produce. So you can see here, for example, for cropland, that the agri-outlook results lie flatly in the middle. So our average across our models produces somewhat sharper abandonment patterns than in the baseline. And then going towards grassland, you can see also a very similar outlook for the Europe, where essentially in the agricultural outlook it's almost fully stable. There is a slight dip in the middle. Our models are slightly more a slightly more pronounced abandonment of around 1.4 million hectares. Now for the crop areas and looking into specific crops, we can see some differences emerge if we dig deeper. So in terms of the coarse grains, there the baseline is more towards the lower end of what our models foresee happening, where our models predicted slightly more stable on average. In terms of wheat, the baseline seems to be so the outlook seems to be there quite more optimistic than what our models predict. Our models usually see a slight dip towards 2050. That would happen, which you can see. And they also are, in terms of wheat, they agree fairly strongly, which is quite marked on this. In the oilseeds, the agricultural outlook seems to be much more on towards the maximum end of what our model, what the other models foresee. The other ones see more or less as an almost stable trend there until 2050. No. Ah, okay, it works. Okay, so then turning our attention to the emissions, which is the main focus of the talk, essentially. In terms of global emissions, we all agree that there is essentially that there is an increasing pattern in global agricultural emissions, and indeed the models that we used there were, as you can see, also more pessimistic than the outlook, which they see a markedly sharper increase in agricultural emissions until 2050, and similarly in the EU, they to have a stronger agreement. So the emissions decline overall. So for the EU, this seems to be more similar. For the crop emission trends, there is some differences, although they more or less line out with the outlook. The strongest difference is in oil seeds, where the baseline seems to be a bit more stronger in the emission patterns. Now, overall, we can see from these exercises, there are multiple figures that we produced. We looked at all the indicators, but overall, a key component is that the outlook produces one stable line, whereas if you put in multiple models, you get a far stronger results and sometimes also markedly diverging. And this is due to the different data assumptions on which these models rely on. We also looked at climate change events, so I wanted to highlight this specifically, where we also checked what happens if we include stronger climate change, as opposed to, because this is more and more a reality. So you see more and more how essentially anomalies in soil moisture, for example, can affect things. How this enters our models is that essentially we have climate for general circulation models, which show their impacts on global crop, on the crop yields, on forest yields, on the livestock, and essentially this runs into the economic models. And we can calculate, of course, the production effects and the GHG effects. And we also can get, which I won't go too strongly into this, the biodiversity impacts and the hydrological impacts of these outcomes. And in terms of climate change, we specifically wanted, once we had this baseline aligned, we wanted to see how this comes together when we essentially impose a relatively drastic climate shock, I would say. So we used RCP 8.5, which is one of the stronger scenarios in there, just to have a very pessimistic marker. And you see then climate change crop yield shocks from a quite pessimistic model, which was below average. It has mixed impacts for EU and the rest of the world. It differs per crop type. So and sometimes it can be beneficial as well in terms of yields. You can see this on the maps in the bottom. And in overall cropland trends, I introduced another layer to this graphics. So essentially with the climate change, if we revisit this, you can see the blue kind of range shows how our trends change. And the small dots are the average is with climate change, whereas the dashed line is the average across the baselines without the climate change effects. So you can see essentially a shift upwards in cropland, so in the land area for cropland, and this is slightly less. So you need more land with the climate change impact. So which comes a bit closer to the Agri Outlook results in terms of average. And also we can see also in terms of imports, how this would affect the import patterns of the EU. You can see that on the left-hand side, the imports and the exports. And for the imports, there is marked uncertainty across the models, how they would see this. They usually see the imports a bit lower than the outlook, and it can go up or down, essentially, depending a bit on the elasticities and on how the models represent things. On the export side, the models see essentially stronger exports with this climate change patterns. And we don't just also go to this kind of uncertainties. I won't present you to time this constraints as results here, but also our baseline and especially this kind of uncertainties that we are representing vis-a-vis the medium-term outlook is we also look at other shifters that can change departures, in a sense, from this outlook. And these kind of shifts can come through trade barriers or tariffs and energy price increases and fertilizer price increases. So these kind of increases will be reflected in addition to the climate change in our baseline, and all of our free projects or policy or scenarios and the policies that we recommend will also take this kind of uncertainty into account of a highly uncertain future that we don't know by 2050 how much of trade barriers are persistent, how much are energy price increases persistent, or how the fertilizer prices might look like. So we have various assumptions on this. And we also present some solutions early on. I mean, the models, Lamasus will have its final scenarios next year, and then afterwards Brightspace and Act4Cup. But I also distributed to each of you a bit of a recent policy brief that we had, a position paper jointly across our projects, where we looked at the agricultural sector, and we looked at the agricultural sector as a key component that could transform the EU economy and the EU society, which could rise essentially to the challenge. It might be small in terms of GDP by itself, but if you look at the full supply chain of the upstream and downstream, it has a fairly it is a fairly large component of the economy. And essentially, we looked at the different ways to unlock its potential, and this position paper sees multiple of these areas, outlines key priorities, and serve as a foundation for the scenarios that the different projects would deliver. So it's kind of a roadmap. It's available online. You can find a QR code also there, and the key messages summarized. Overall, you have it's from the perspective of these economic models. We look at the current performance of the sector, or in terms of agri-food competitiveness, food security, and the environment. We look at the economic opportunities where growth for the sector can come from, so both in terms of the agri-food sector, the non-food bioeconomy, or the digital economy. And essentially, then we see that we can, by investing into the sector, and then by having strong investments into the sector, one can have food security, sustainability, and also unlock the economic potential. So you have these kind of 5 levers, which is that you can have a stronger innovation in the bioeconomy, which there is results that this can spill over. Also, the digital inclusion in agriculture, where where Europe is quite leading. And this kind of part, so this is one of the potential areas that was seen as one of the stronger areas, and integrated nutrient management and fostering income and resilience via results-based policies. And essentially, in the last part, we also outline how the models can better support this. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamas. We need to move on in terms of time, but I can't resist but to ask you the question. Just take one of those factors, not necessarily yet built into your work, trade and tariff barriers, and non-trade tariff barriers that become part of the consequence of the tariffs. Let's assume they become sticky over the next 20, 25 years. I know you're probably going to be able to give me a high-level answer or even a hunch. What do you think that would do to the outcomes and the models you've just presented there?
Well, it's difficult to say because I would need to run the models. I mean,
just your hunch.
But I mean, we had some preliminary scenarios. So, for example, I mean, what Anna-Louise also presented was very nice. We were also looking into kind of the implications of CBAM and similar ideas. So you can have, of course, it's a difficult challenge for the policy always in these cases to not have also the spillovers too strong, right? And also to keep this kind of bill for the public essentially low enough, right? And that's, I think, something which with the modeling we are really exploring of what those key levers are. I mean, I think I was thinking during your presentation, Anna, where we were looking at this. Indeed, we saw also, like, not in the histosol specifically, but also with similar technologies, where you tax essentially the carbon in the soils, right? And then it was difficult then sometimes not to essentially make the global emissions even worse, right? So in the EU, of course, it's super beneficial. Sometimes the production suffers more, sometimes less. I think one clear outcome was that very strong public investment also then is needed, right? Because I think if we, for example, invested some of the money back, or let's say invested additional money into into precision farming and similar technologies, that was one of the scenarios where also you had a global win challenge. But I mean, it costs also, like that has a clear cost to it. But there are some pathways which we could isolate there. Yeah?
Did you want to come in on that, Anna Luisa? No, okay. Such a fascinating presentation, and what you said there would spark probably a conference in and of itself. Tamas, thank you very much indeed for that. If you would both stay with us, I'd now like to bring my other panelists onto the stage, if I may. As they are making their way up, I'll introduce them. Eric Matthijs is Director of the Sustainable Food Economics Research Group at KU Leuven. Emanuele Paolo Sicura, a long-standing friend of the Forum Policy Officer at DG Climate with the European Commission, and online, a man that I follow closely, although we've never actually met, Ed, and I hope to put that to rest one day. I was hoping we might have had the opportunity here this morning, but notice you're online. Ed Davey is, of course, head of the World Resources Institute Europe, the UK office, and a senior advisor to the Food and Land Use Coalition. Ed, you're very welcome indeed. Great to have you with us, even virtually. We're going to get into the discussion on perspectives on what you've all heard in the room here this morning. But also asking you to give you, all of you, a little bit of an opportunity to share your thoughts and react to the outcomes presented in the OECD FAO report, and then obviously, as we said, the reflections on the first panel. Eric, just as you're kind of getting settled there, I am going to start with you, if that's okay. Give us your thoughts on what you've heard so far.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for the opportunity to reflect on the outlook also from a scientific approach. I've written down three things that, and some of them link to the outlook, and some of them are more like reflections. The first one is obviously the focus is on greenhouse gas emission, and you will hear me coming. What about the other impacts? What about biodiversity? What about water retention? And we do see this kind of, as we saw in the first presentation, these unintended consequences. I mean, if we're going to convert grassland into cropland, I mean, we've seen more runoff in the Netherlands. We'll see a rise in crop protection products. Biodiversity will change. So there's some unintended consequences there that we need to take into account also from a policy perspective. And I would really also look out to the modeling community and say, please try to have a more bundled approach rather than this sliced out approach, not only to the academic world, but also actually to the policy world and to business. So rather than slicing out, oh, let's increase carbon and get a payment for that, and no, let's look at a bundle of things. Let's look at synergies and trade-off. Because basically, if you look from an arable farmer perspective, the carbon price is not going to make him do much because it's not high enough. It's the water retention capacity that matters for him, right? That's what actually is going to be the biggest incentive. The second point I would like to make also relates a little bit to what Tassos was saying about soil health. I'm just coming back from Aarhus, from Denmark, where he had the EU Mission Soil Week, talking about practice, about finance especially. And I think in the farmer toolbox, there is all kinds of technologies, and some of them you can use combined, like robotics, precision farming, remote sensing. What kind of solution you do, you can always do that. But some of them actually, you have to choose between one or the other. And I'm really I'm specifically talking about nature-based solutions versus more chemistry-based solutions or biotech-based solutions. And there you can probably not combine them so well. And I think one of the main issues and the main points I would like to say also about the shifting supply curve, there's a time dimension. I think one set of solutions will shift your curve faster than the other solutions. And there is this I mean, what I mean is that chemistry-based solutions, they work faster. They have immediate results, but of course, at a price, at an environmental price. Whereas nature-based solutions are much slower, which means that there is additional finance problems. Policy. I mean, the policymaker is very impatient, may not allow a transition period or too short. I think that's a second thing I would like to point on. And I'm also missing a little bit these nature-based solutions in the outlooks. It's like, where are they? And I'm kind of, I mean, one of my takeaways is, well, 30% is technology anyway, right? 70% is actually land use. So that was, for me, quite a shocking result. And then maybe a last point, if you may, is something that it's also maybe a question to the modelers. What about the biophysical material balance? And you can apply that. I mean, that's a very basic thing. I mean, if we all want more biomass in the soil, for example, to increase soil health, where does that biomass have to come from? From a Nordic perspective, from a Belgian perspective, well, we have too much of it. But if you look at Southern Europe, where does all that biomass have to come from? You know, I mean, there is this simple material balance that we have to take into account. And if you up it actually at a larger level, I think also in the wake of the geopolitical situation and the desire of Europe to become more resilient and more self-sufficient, well, that also. But if we are going to do things ourselves more, it means less import, but less import also means less export, because you can't, I mean, there's no magic. If you import less nutrients, you can't export more nutrients, right? There's no magic formula that actually, so these kind of biophysical conditions and truths, really basic things, I think also in the policy realm should be taken into account when talking about policies. And maybe also in the modeling, I think different models take that in a different way into approach, but I think that's also an important element to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I would like to bring, in the interest of having a conversation on here rather than just presentation, I will give both Tamas and Anna-Luisa the opportunity to respond on that question on biomass. What's your thinking about that? To you, Eric, you know, we've talked many times, I think, on this kind of a subject. I detect a growing frustration with you that we don't yet have that capacity to understand what the trade-offs actually are and to explain them. If that's correct, how are we going to solve that? I mean, is it just modeling, or is it even just an appetite and a capacity to look at those trade-offs honestly and then communicate them?
Well, we do observe an increasing appetite to do that. I mean, that's what we were talking about yesterday in Aarhus in Denmark, and also from a business perspective. I think businesses do increasingly understand that, and that's maybe a fourth point I would like to talk about, that resilience matters for them, and that they're actually investing in making their supply chains more resilient by helping farmers and other land managers to become more resilient. Or even, you know, next step is that many of the corporates are even going into farming, buying up, investing directly, which is quite interestingly. I mean, we haven't seen that. I mean, we're talking about prices not decreasing anymore, but we haven't seen actually this kind of interest of the food industry, for example, in the beverage industry, in primary industry. So I think they know that they realize more and more that it needs to be done. A big problem is a free rider issue. I mean, this is actually why many of these things need time. If I'm going to move, but my competitor is not going to move, but will benefit from some of these public goods, we have a problem, right? So that's, I think, one of the biggest barriers to actually getting these results on the ground.
I would concur. You know, on the point of optimism, I've never seen such a stronger, not just interest, but genuine action on the corporation side to move from investing, which perhaps was in the past sometimes in that area of corporate responsibility, to actually this is about business resilience here now. Clearly not everyone is there. Clearly not everyone is there at the right scale. Clearly not everyone is there in terms of doing the right thing. but the interest is definitely there, and I think that's something that we need to build on. Let me just quickly bring in Tamas and Ana-Luisa again on the biophysical biomass question that Eric raised, and then I'm going to bring Edward in, because I know you need to leave, Edward, by 11:15 our time. Ana-Luisa, Tamas, which of you wants to pick that up?
Well, I think from my side it's somehow easy, because we don't look into this. So yeah, on the biomass and the balance, we don't actually look into this. But yeah, I'm happy to hear from you suggestions on that. Yeah, Tamas.
Yeah, from our perspective, I mean, thanks a lot. I mean, these were really great points, all three of them. I think maybe just on the first one, if I can tackle that earlier, I agree completely that the biodiversity and water retention and things like this need to be emphasized more in the outlook. The projects aim specifically for that, and the advantages, I mean, you have seen the models there, lots of them are involved in the outlook and the JRC modeling, so in a sense the academic versions of them will be upgraded, and then the institutions can also take this up and produce this easier. So Lamasus is, for example, specifically about bringing in the biodiversity and the climate trade-offs versus the economic trade-offs. Brightspace is about looking at safe and just operating space boundaries, also looking a bit at the societal boundaries of things, and also looking where the EU can act. So I think these are all projects that reply to that. In terms of the biomass, this is something which, at least in the paper, was also highlighted, that the projects should stronger, and the models should stronger focus on this. This is quite clearly one of the modeling needs, where we need to have this circularity of the biomass flow very strongly in the models that are used for this, and that are, I mean, there is some early applications and some simpler treatment of this, where we can see this kind of material flows and how much is there, etc. But I think much more can be done. So.
Great. Thank you to you both. Ed, I'm going to bring you in at this stage to reflect on obviously what you heard from Eric and no doubt have heard this morning. I'm interested to the extent that you can also on that point of where you see the shift in corporation interest in investing in resilience and perhaps moving away from what we might have called in the past CSR, corporate social responsibility. Ed, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. This has been such a good conversation, and it's a privilege to be part of it. I'll share a few thoughts, starting with the corporation question, and I ask for your forgiveness in advance for leaving at past. I wish I could stay. We're all running around on COP30, and it's all coming to a head today, including on a fertilizer declaration, which we're hoping the Commission will endorse in the coming days, that the UK and Brazil have been involved in. On the corporations, I think many of the corporations are still moving or seeking to move in the right direction here. They may be saying less about it, but they are still in. And they're in because of the economics of this transition, the need for resilience, as others have mentioned, and also because they believe that citizens are still concerned about this agenda of food, health, climate. And so my hope is that many of the most important corporations across the continent are still in. They may be saying less overtly, which is a shame, because I think we need them to still speak up on this agenda. But they're still in. They're still thinking through the issues, even in this very constrained environment. With your permission, Mark, I'll just make 3 points over 5 minutes or so, with renewed thanks, because this really has been a very, very insightful conversation, and I'm sorry not to be with you in person. The first is about the farmers. I feel like the most important thing for this work now is to ensure that the farmers are in the room, that they are shaping this conversation. Nothing about us without us, in a sense. I've seen the importance of the involvement of farmers in a profound way here in the UK, where over the last 7 years, as you know, we have pursued a reform to agricultural subsidies post-Brexit. Would that it were not so, but it has been a silver lining, in a sense, of Brexit, that there has been this chance to revisit the agricultural subsidy regime, at least in England, and in the devolved administrations too. But in order to secure success in that transition, the farmers have to be involved in a really significant way. It can't be done in a top-down way. There has to be a genuine seat at the table for the farmers. And so that's my first reflection. Since so many of the farmers across Europe are pursuing amazing innovations and transition, including on soil, as colleagues have mentioned, regenerative agriculture, fertilizer use, some of the technologies that have been mentioned, how do we really elevate farmer voice, ensure that it's the farmers speaking about this transition themselves, showcasing best practice? Farmers learn from farmers, as we know. So that's a first reflection on the centrality of farmer voice. The second reflection is on the politics of this. There's a disconnect somehow, isn't there, between the scale of the reduction in emissions from food and land use that is needed for the EU to meet its NDC as announced yesterday. I mean, it's really quite striking, the level of emissions reductions that are needed, and the politics of this transition, for the reasons I've just given, which is inherently very difficult. And I think the answer to that is to find really compelling stories about the value of this transition, which don't start from climate and emissions, as others have said, but start from health, from water, from resilience, from income, from a sense of the future, custodianship, a love of the land. I think soil, the health of the soil, as others have mentioned. I think we need to find ways of telling a story about this transition that are attractive and intuitive, and again, don't come across as top-down, de haut en bas, etc. And I do find Madame von der Leyen very compelling in this way, in the way she speaks about food and farming. And I also, of course, found Timmermans very attractive on this issue way back when. But I think we need to find voices in the political community across Europe who can speak about this issue with authenticity and integrity, and in a way that carries people with us on this journey. A part of that is also about the system as a whole, as others have mentioned. I was thinking of Dr. David Nabarro, this lovely man who died recently, who thought a lot about the food system as a whole. And I feel like that was the beauty of Farm to Fork, in a sense. It brought this all together, and I think the recent dialogue also did that. Let's try to keep that sense of the system as a whole together as we take forward this journey together. My last reflection is on the need for good process, for dialogue, for mediation, for providing spaces like the forum, which I've always loved and valued, where people come together to talk about these issues in a non-ideological way and in a way that's focused on trying to broker solutions. And I think that can happen across the level of the continent as a whole in Brussels, but it can also happen in place. And my concluding reflection is, so much of this agenda, I think, needs to be taken forward in particular places, whether it's states, regions, landscapes, where these actors are all working together. It doesn't all have to be at the level of the continent or the nation state. Let's also celebrate where a landscape or a place is trying to really make progress on the future of food and agriculture and the food system. And my very last reflection is on the Mediterranean diet. I don't know if you've all read the Eat Lancet 2.0 yet, or other recent reports of its kind, but my simplistic takeaway from it is that if the whole of the continent shifted with love and attention much closer and much faster towards a Mediterranean diet, we would get so much closer to the kind of food future in Europe that's needed for the climate, but also for people's health. It's not about foregoing meat altogether, but it's about eating less and better meat. And we've published on that issue. It's about reducing food loss and waste. It's about ensuring that food is affordable, of course, and nutritious. But there is a story here, and it so happens that here in beloved Europe, there is a diet that could really spell a future for the planet in this area. So I hope that some of those reflections are of modest help, and it's been lovely to join you. I'll stay for a few more minutes and then drop off quietly. Thank you, Mark. Back to you.
Thank you, Ed. Before you drop off quietly, maybe again I may use moderator's privilege and just come back to you on a couple of things. So much of what you said there resonates. I want to talk about what you referred to as stories. Some people in this room know that I spent a lot of time in the US over the last 6 or 7 years talking to farmers there that jumped into regenerative agriculture and talk about it not from a climate perspective, but in terms of a value to their business, to their land, to their future. If I'm going to just to build on that, how does your organization, do you have any thoughts about how the different actors can bring stories like that to the fore that gives encouragement to farmers, to corporations, to not only invest in, but to stay the course of some of the actions that they're already taking? Because to go back to where Leanne started this morning, there is positivity in this, and we can start from that positive point. But how do we do that? How do we make the positivity greater than, dare I say it, some of the pessimism that we have in this debate, that we can't do it?
I think it's all about the power of a good example and about drawing attention to where things are going well. Emmanuel Faber gave a lovely talk in Oxford the other day about what he had done when he was at the helm of Danone. It's so important that corporates actually speak up about the good practices that they are pursuing and the value that has generated for farmers and in the supply chain. And I think I come back to that point about farmers themselves stepping up and talking. I mean, I think of some of the young farmers across the EU who've been doing regenerative farming and doing some really incredible work. And I think some of those younger voices also are very important. And let's find ways as policymakers and others of stepping back, in a sense, not leading this conversation and giving the platform to others who are at the vanguard of this transition. I also think, coming back to my point about food and diet, that's another way in. Every citizen in Europe wants to talk about food. There is a love of food across our continent. Thank you for including the UK in the continent, by the way. And let's all have that conversation about food and also about place, the food that people love in place. Thanks.
Well, as they say, enjoy, it's from Europe, is a nice tagline. Ed, thanks so much indeed. I hope that you and I and the forum will continue to have these conversations. I hugely appreciate you taking time to join us this morning in what is obviously a busy day. So thank you for that, Ed, and we look forward to continue with you.
Best wishes to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Emanuele, I don't know how you bring all this together. You've heard from the modelers, you've heard some of the advice and indeed challenge from Eric. You've heard from Ed there at World Resources Institute. How do we translate all of this data, all of the progress that we can make? How do we translate that into policy that enables us to scale and go faster? Big question. I'll give you as much time as I can within the agenda to answer it.
Thank you, Mark, and I'm very glad to be again into a very insightful event of the forum. Actually, there were so many good ideas that I've heard so far, but I would like to start with a key takeaway that I retained from reading the Outlook, which is the fact that it's one of the key messages says that real agricultural commodity prices are set to decline due to the fact of continuous productivity increases and efficiency into the agricultural supply chain to respond to the increased demand. So the prices will go down, and this would immediately translate into putting pressure on farmers, especially small farmers, especially European farmers that we know already are suffering from lack of competitiveness on global markets. And I think we should start starting from this key takeaway. We can reflect on the fact that it is paramount to find ways to reward farmers as they deliver other ecosystem services beyond the food that comes to our tables, and to reflect on how the overall climate transition can be translated into business opportunities for farmers as we aim to strengthen the resilience of the agri-food supply chains, especially in Europe. And I think this is exactly the perspective that we are taking currently at the European Commission and at DG Clima. Our focus is on how we can reflect on all the figures, all the data that have been shared so far, and how we can translate this into a system that provides farmers with additional complementary income. And that's the reason why at DG Clima I think we have built, this is the rationale behind the infrastructure of the carbon removals and carbon farming certification regulation, which is a framework. And as you know, we are currently working on implementing it with the specific methodologies for carbon farming. But also we are equally thinking about which are the enabling measures and which are, the solutions that we need to put in place to really create demand for those CRCF units and credits that will be generating going forward. And here the point is, I want to come back on something that you just discussed now, which is the investments of the private sector. Here the biggest opportunity that we have is to leverage public, but also private capital that for the first time is channeling into the agriculture sector. So the biggest opportunity that we have is really to leverage this opportunity in order to make sure that we deliver opportunities for farmers. And how we can do that? We can do that in the framework of CRCF, which is the scope also of my work, by working on certain work streams. The first one is thinking about how we can enhance greater alignments with international standards. So companies are working with international standards, the GHG protocol, they have science-based targets. We need to make sure that CRCF can play a role there. And of course, they are doing this to strengthen their resilience, but also to deliver on their Scope 3 emissions. So this CRCF needs to be useful also when it comes to accounting emissions, also in the framework of existing legislation such as the CSRD. And then the third element is like how we can reflect on ways with which by enhancing, how we can enhance voluntary approaches to really strengthen the demand of these CRCF units by building a public partnership approach, but also collaboration across the different companies and actors of the agri-food supply chain. And here I want to reflect on something that Eric also mentioned. When we working together on delivering ecosystem services on public goods, one of the risks is really free riding. But I think there is an understanding more and more also in the private sector that through a collaborative, pre-competitive approach, we can achieve results. And I think our duty as the Commission is to create that level playing field, to create that predictability that companies would need to invest into agriculture and to deliver on so many challenges, but also opportunities, because I think we have a lot of opportunities in the climate transition for the agri-food systems that we see and that we are discussing also in the framework of this conversation. So I would start with that.
Emmanuel, thank you for that. I'm going to bring this session to a close, and then we'll move into the next one in a second. And then I want to leave time at the end of the next one for bringing the audience in. So please do have your questions and answers. One final question to you, Emmanuel, which I give you full license not to answer because I recognize it's a tricky one. When you look across the piece, how well do you think that we are doing at aligning public policy to send the right signals into the market of what we value and what we're prepared to fund? And I do give you license not to answer the question if you don't want to.
Well, you know my also background. So I come from the private sector into a public job. And I think what gives me hope, personally, is the fact that we are trying. And that's my experience so far in the Commission. We are trying.
And that is a positive and good answer. Thank you, Emanuele. Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, give our panelists a fantastic round of applause. They did a great job. Thank you.